So since 9/11, and especially after 2005, academics writing about the state in cultural production, including visual art, increasingly began to engage the limits of representational categories, such as South Asian, and I think the panel before the performance was sort of speaking to this at the end, as the basis for political organizing and cultural engagement. Increasingly, we saw comparative and not just diasporic transnational frameworks shaping South Asian American diasporic cultural politics, and sometimes a turn away from a politics of representation to one based in the affective experiences of belonging or non-belonging. And I think one example of this is actually the work of Mariam Ghani and Chitra Ganesh in their Index of the Disappeared, a warm database, which I think has been valuable for me and others of us that teach sort of like in Asian American studies or diaspora studies, and teaching our students about counter narratives to the quote cold data, right, age, nationality, citizenship status that's produced by the state surveillance of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian populations, especially after 9/11. This comparative and affective turn informs my current project on comparative, feminist, and queer South Asian diasporas, tentatively titled Global Intimacy. South Asian, as many of us know, was a term intended to critique a dominant strain of Indocentrism in South Asian American studies. It's also a term that, as Bakarti Mani observes, takes shape within domestic frameworks of race and ethnicity in the US, as well as in relation to neoliberal formations of citizenship in South Asia. So it constitutes what she calls a fragile coalition of coherent community. And again, I think the panel before was sort of speaking to the fragility of this coherence. In colonial diasporic contexts such as the Caribbean, East and South Africa, South Asian might be a less useful way of understanding what Black studies scholar Robin D.G. Kelly, citing Patrick Wolfe, calls regimes of race. Regimes of race refers to, quote, the diversity distinguishing the regimes of difference with which colonizers have sought to manage subject populations. For Kelly and scholars like myself working and thinking about race and diaspora through comparative frameworks, regimes of race productively complicates the assumption that South Asian artists working in the US are influenced primarily by US racial formations, or even subcontinental politics and culture, and demonstrates their engagements with the mutability of race, especially in other diasporic homelands. How do Blackness and indigeneity or settler colonialism, and I think we need to take seriously the way that settler colonialism is intertwined with other colonial projects, how do they become central to understanding Indianness? And again, I use that term specifically because that is in some ways a more politically salient term for colonial diasporas, right? So how do those become central to understanding Indianness and South Asianness in these artworks? How can we understand Blackness and or as indigeneity, because let's not forget that indigeneity is also specific to the African context, right? Not all Blackness is tied to slave histories. How do we understand this as central to South Asian diasporic art in ways that may be less legible to South Asian audiences and even to curators and artists with access to particular kinds of social and cultural capital within entrenched networks and communities? So I want to think about something more than a solidarity with model. And I think that is a political imperative that's taken on even greater significance in the wake of something like Black Lives Matter, and more about South Asian visual art as already infused with and constituted by different racial regimes of Blackness, in the case that I'm interested in, including indigenous Blackness that's distinct from Black Atlantic diasporas that are tied to the transatlantic slave trade, and including Black aesthetics and Black political histories. And I could rattle off a list of names of like people who are already doing this work, including Kareem's work on Blackness in India, in the gay nightclub scene, the work of Alan D'Souza, Shailaja Patel, and others. But I want to actually draw attention to a specific artwork. So as a deliberate act of making visible new and emerging artists within the rubric of South Asian visual art, I want to talk briefly about visual artist Jordache Alepin's photographic essay, Queering the Archive, which will appear in a forthcoming issue of Scholar and Feminist Online called Queer and Feminist Afro-Asian Formations that I'm co-editing with my colleague Ananta Sudhakar at San Francisco State. Alepin was born, raised, and produces much of his visual art in South Africa, and he works as an academic and artist in the US. Across his photographs and short film, Cane, C-A-N-E, /Cain, C-A-I-N, Alepin visualizes Indian migration to South Africa through queer brown male bodies that multiply disrupt dominant black nationalist histories of the post-apartheid South African nation. In Queering the Archive, Alepin superimposes family photographs onto historical photographs of Indian past documents. These documents classify the race, gender, and marital status of migrant men who came to South Africa under indentureship and were issued by the colonial South African state beginning in the 19th century. Focusing on the bodily proximities between Indian men and the appearance of a mixed-race ancestor among the family photographs, Alepin visualizes queer male and interracial intimacies as part of the colonial history of the apartheid state. What he calls transgressive erotics, which bears the aesthetic influence of African and Black diasporic artists such as Rotimi Fani Coyote, Robert Mapplethorpe, and Isaac Julian, allow us to see how whiteness, blackness, and queerness haunt the formation of Indian identity in South Africa, despite both the apartheid states and the Indian migrant families' insistence on racial discreteness, Indian, colored, black, and white, and on compulsory heterosexuality. So my time's up, but I can talk more about sort of Alepin's weird positioning as not a South Asian artist, right, but as somebody who is ethnically Indian, and sort of his, the kind of frictions, I think, with that term that are important to consider, I think, in a conversation that we're having.
So I'm going to condense several research questions here in my 5 minutes, and also to take into account my investment in Indian and diasporic histories. So Fatal Love, Where Are We Now? That's the title of this panel in this symposium, which I would like to flip from the locational where to the possibly more temporal when are we now? The when recalls the title of Indian art critic Geetha Kapoor's When Was Modernism in Indian Art? A challenge to Raymond Williams' question, when was modernism? This book, first published in 2000, marked a moment of transition in Indian art criticism and the evaluation of art history of the subcontinent, which is now in the process of changing, of course, with the diaspora's re-entry into more mainstream spaces within the subcontinent. But more pertinently and more persuasively, when are we now? Is the diasporic condition a historical one, or is it a contemporary one? In light of this question, and Fatal Love, Where Are We Now?, I would like to return back self-consciously to the past, to Amour Fou, or Mad Love, which recalls the 1935 surrealist novel of the same name, and the enterprise to resolve madness and desire, which to an extreme could be a play on the fatal that the title alerts us to. The play of fatal and love also forces us to think about the Freudian death and sex drives, the dual impulse investigated by Roja Kaiwa in his study of insect behavior. The mimicry of insects and their ability to capture and hypnotize and ultimately devour their prey could, to quote Kaiwa, catch the sorcerer in his own trap. So precisely where are we now? Is there a notion of the Freudian return of the repressed? Or is there a way in which to resolve the interplay and repetitive and recursive nature of the drives? Can we move beyond them? Let's say to consider the new imaginary that Fatal Love might represent from the point of view of the contemporary, or to put it more precisely, when are we now? The we-ness of the where are we now, from the original exhibition, also becomes the question of the we, of the solidarity of group politics and group think, and the place of the individual or a set of individuals amongst them. This is always a negotiation. The individual I to the we of the solidarity that suggests unity, but also exclusion in the defining of the noun. There is also historical reasons for this. If we think just after 2005, and the political playing field, of course, has changed since 2006. In 2006, the OCI was established for Indians, blurring the lines, at least for India, between resident and non-resident, and home country and diaspora. These policies allowed the diaspora long-term or lifetime visas and included, amongst other benefits, the rights to certain types of employment within India. The focus on the originary status or blood ties extended the rights of the diaspora to enjoy nearly the same as those of the citizen. A number of artists here present too have viable careers in India, if always troubled to some extent by the question of whether one is Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. You can use your own substitutions enough. Some of these issues were revisited in a very important show that took place here at the Queen's Museum in 1997 in an exhibition titled Out of India, curated by the late Jane Farver. In this exhibition, two moments were looked at in terms of commemoration. 1997 and as a 50-year marker of Indian independence from 1947. And a few years ago, Arshia Lopandwala's show After Midnight here at the Queen's Museum did very much the same. She looked at the question of Indian art and questions of the diaspora in relationship to two moments, 1947 and 1997. So the pains of partition in 1947, which we heard Anu speak about earlier, have yet to fully heal, and the number of artists continuing to draw the dividing line in their work has become representative and emblematic of this trauma. And we also saw this earlier when Chitra Ganesh showed us an image of a bleeding wound from the Fatal Love show from 2005. So the return of the dividing line becomes representative in some ways of that trauma, of that moment of 47, as do wounds and cuts and knives as well. Here we see this from the show that opened yesterday, as well as seeing how it works generationally and also geographically in terms of the Black arts movement in Britain. So the diaspora becomes a traumatic return to the moments of partition and the re-experience of the original wounds of displacement, of migration, of exile, or the threads that appear to connect us. So the question of fatal love and the lucid dreams returns us back to the question of the dream, the distant vision, the local one, the trauma, the seduction, and the way in which temporal categories of the past, present, and future seem to continue to collide and in fact constitute a language of the South Asian diaspora that touches upon and reinvests these questions as we shift from fatal love, the sorcerer, the trap, the digestion, the seduction, and shift to the displacement and reinvestment of these questions in terms of migration and memory and the tools, methods, and imaginaries that we continue to use to both reevaluate and express them. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for your patience and for sticking it out this evening. My name is Asma Naeem. I'm a curator at the National Portrait Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. I wanted to make a couple comments before I turn to my presentation. It's been a fascinating day filled with a lot of interesting topics, and I can see so many intersections. I am an outsider here. I know that sounds quite strange to say that. But I have been an Americanist. I am trained as an American art historian. This is my first time in this kind of venue. And so it's been very enlightening and illuminating for me to see how South Asian artists, curators, and art historians discuss all of these issues that I've been looking at from a vantage point, much like what Basira was doing in her performance, if you will, kind of inverting the outsider-insider perspective, who's under the veil, who's outside the veil, all of these positions of peripheries and center narratives that we're used to. I have been trying to find a voice for artistic production within American art. So that is particularly the tone that I have and the inflection that I have in my work. Just another quick comment. I am a curator. Jayashree, who I would like to thank, and Lawrence as well. Hello, Lawrence. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all the institutions that have been involved here. It's a privilege to be here, so thank you. As a curator, there are many issues that I consider for the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, which is an institution devoted to telling the history and the cultural narratives of America. And we focus on American producers of that history sometimes. So discussing what is American, what isn't American, who is an American, who is American, these issues are central to what I'm doing on a daily basis. And so this has been something that I can discuss with all of you or any of you at a later point. The last point I'll make is the issues of power, of voice, of audience that have been intertwined in so many talks today is also a complex one. And so I'm looking at an audience that is much broader than whom we see here. I would like to have American art historians who know nothing about, some of them know nothing about partition. Some of them have no clue that that occurred. And so when I've given papers and discussed this historical trauma, it's been revelatory for my colleagues with whom I've shared many, many years and many, many classes. So I'd like to turn now to my project, and I hope that gives you kind of a little bit of an appreciation of why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it, because some may find it difficult or problematic. So the project is called Leaving Yourself Behind, the Partition of India and Its Aftermath in American Art. And I think it was Gautam. Is Gautam still here, or did he leave? He left. So Gautam was talking about taxonomies, and I think that is the major problem here, that American art has been invested with a taxonomic impulse to contain and create a nationalized image and a nationalized border system. And so for us to consider artists who have migrated, who are transcultural, within the rubric of American art is a difficult concept. So after I got my PhD, I taught a class called Contemporary Islamic Art. And as I was going through my PowerPoints at 3 a.m., and I know all of you who have taught before can sympathize, I realized that the person who took the photographs that have become iconic with partition was an American woman. Khushwant Singh, many people who have created literary and artistic representations and historical representations of partition use Margaret Bourke White's photographs. What does that mean? How does her Americanness inflect her subjectivity and her approach to picturing this event, and how has that been elided in all of these other cultural actors and producers in using these images for their own nationalistic or religious aims? So that's one of the questions that I started to ask, and as I delved a little deeper, I realized that somebody whom I had written my master's on, Shazia Sakundar, was a generational response in some ways to the event of partition. And I found as a middle ground, as somebody who had grown up during partition, the art of Zarina. How much time do I have? Okay. So basically I would just like to start with end with the idea that cultural and artistic geography is not consistent with physical and cartographic geography. And in my project, I hope to explore all three of these artists and explore how their ability to micro-assimilate in different cultures, to adapt to different customs in their new countries that they visit, will inflect the artistic production, and basically try to open up the boundaries of American art and what is an American artist. Thank you.
The decision was to speak about Fatal Love, where we are now, academic trajectories in South Asian art. So my comments are strictly about, it's not about artists, any specific artist or work. It's strictly about academic, the trajectory of academic research and teaching, where South Asian issues fall in that broader context, and my comments are less theoretical and more, I would say, down to earth, and in a way, probably some of you will find it confrontational, probably. The way I see it, our understanding of culture went through two important transitions as we stepped into the 21st century. One is that we lost the romantic view of globalization. We came to realize the fact that this new phenomenon wasn't going to make us citizens of some utopian global village, as it was called in the 90s, but that it is an immensely complex set of intertwined economic, social, political, and cultural discourses fraught with power imbalances and violent agendas. The other shift is what I call the demise of the kind of populist multiculturalism of the previous decades, when various identities were busy defining and positioning themselves against marginalization, often with an inarticulate view of what that actually meant. Whereas ethnic, racial, and other such identities had always spoken out against exclusion and essentialism, all such issues paled in the first decade of this century when facing the stark reality, not only of aggressive forms of profiling and nefarious ways of othering, but of detention, rendition, without legal recourse, even disappearance, far graver forms of injustice that were inconceivable in Western democracies even a decade earlier. In the context of South Asian cultural discourse in this country, it is this turning point, I think, that the Fatal Love exhibition represented back in 2005. When I first came to the United States in the 1980s as a graduate student, art history courses in South Asian art at the few institutions where they were offered routinely ended with the advent of British rule in the region, let alone South Asian contemporary art, and much less the creative output of South Asian artists living in Western metropoles. The ignorance and lack of interest in American academia with regard to 20th century modern art, not just in South Asia but in all post-colonies, seems shocking on hindsight. A look at the trend in doctoral dissertations is a case in point. In the 1990s, albeit still a handful, one could find doctoral students in the subfield of, say, African art, for instance, choosing to focus their dissertation research on contemporary African artists, including transnational ones, as it happened in my own case, because I come from African studies. That's a long story why. But there was hardly any instance of any doctoral work in South Asian art. One could effortlessly count the critics or art historians interested in the subject, the Holland Cotters and the Thomas Machiavellis. What is even more curious in this context is that in the same era, 80s and 90s, names of South Asian critical theorists, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, Partha Chatterjee, were well known in seminar rooms. Their essays were part of every darn reading list. The legacy of subaltern studies, for example, was prominent in the humanities and social sciences, yet anything related to the study of South Asian art and visual culture remained shamefully marginalized. Now, why was there such a lack of interest in the subject is something we can discuss. But let me say this in passing, with the considerable risk of making some of you uncomfortable, even offended, that this part of this resistance came and still comes from within the subfield of South Asian studies, from veteran scholars who do not think very highly of the topics we are discussing here today. I saw this same resistance in African studies in the 1990s. Now that said, despite all such resistance and reluctance, the above scenario has changed noticeably. Yesterday's gathering at Asia Society and today's crowd here prove that. Not right now. People have left. But the rest of the day. Assembling so many people on this subject was not possible 15 years ago. Doctoral works and publications on both art from South Asia and its diasporas and transnationalisms are on the rise. In my contemporary art courses, I now comfortably discuss such artists without having to provide a defensive introduction. That is why this matters. What is more, all these endeavors fully recognize the complexities of identity formation and survival, including problematization of a South Asian identity following the transitions I described earlier. And while it would be unrealistic to claim that the Fatal Love exhibition singularly changed this scenario, it certainly made its contribution. This change, however, is far from satisfactory. Those who are seriously committed to it know the hurdles they face. While curatorial projects are not within the scope of this panel, I want to recall quickly what we heard from the curators panel this morning, the uphill battles they face, and you can tell this paragraph was added at lunch. The uphill battles they face in their own practices. The most notable and infuriating limitation is in art criticism, except for a handful of critics and art writers who are dedicated to doing their homework. Mainstream art writers who know little about South Asia and its cultures, histories, and its diasporas take the easy way. When writing about an artist of South Asian origin, they resort either to the essentialist route, seeking authentic roots in one's work, or to superficial parallels with big shots in the history of Western modernism as a form of validation. The result is either an outright dismissal or at best a condescending acceptance. There is a crucial question this is a crucial question. How such problems can be addressed? How much of the task of generating new models for art criticism and new histories of the art we are discussing here today falls on us, that is, those who are part of the South Asian cultures of the diasporas. Too much emphasis on ourselves runs the risk of tribalism, where identities are pigeonholed and claim exclusivity. On the other hand, waiting for the establishment to do what is right, as we know well, is not an option. So I guess this warrants an ongoing discussion. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for staying till the end of the day, and I'll promise to zip through so that we can chat and then go get something to eat and drink. Thank you to everyone involved in organizing the event. I'm so delighted to be here and to reflect on the past decade following the exhibition of Fatal Love. I've been writing about South Asian diasporic visual culture for the past 15 years as a cultural critic rather than as an art historian. So I'm going to focus on my position as a viewer, a critic, and a curator in relation to the artworks that I see. And I want to focus my remarks on two related issues. The first is, within exhibitions like Fatal Love, which explicitly thematize South Asian diasporic art and experience, what is the effective and critical relationships that's forged between the viewer and the artwork? Specifically, how might we as viewers define ourselves as South Asian diasporic subjects in relation to the art object? And second, what are the other spaces and times that we inhabit in relation to the artwork? How might the artworks that we see remind us of other times and other places, that is, times and places that are not cited within the artwork itself? And in doing so, reconfigure the relationship between South Asia and America, between the past and the present. In my current book project, Haunting Visions, I'm interested in how the curatorial rhetoric of exhibition sites shape the intimate relations of identity and estrangement that we as South Asian diasporic viewers, I realize we don't all identify with that category, craft in relation to the aesthetic project, and I've written about this in relation to Beyond Bollywood, the recent exhibition at the Smithsonian. I argue that our ways of looking at South Asian diasporic visual culture are structured by what I call an uncanny memory of diaspora. The idea that the aesthetic images that we see remind us of other images in other places taken at other times. That is, how we see artwork that represents experiences of immigration and racialization cannot be divorced from the political and social context within which we encounter these art objects, or from the histories and memories that we bring to our viewing practices. So I'm kind of arguing for a very situated way of looking at how racialized subjects view art objects that in turn thematize immigration. So the book focuses on contemporary photograph-based art by South Asian diasporic artists, including Anu Matthews, Seher Shah, and Gary Gill. And so for the rest of my time, I'm going to focus my talk on Matthews' installation work, Fabricated Memories, which I first encountered on display as part of Fatal Love here at the Queen's Museum. And this is a detailed image from Fabricated Memories. We didn't have smartphones then, so this is taken from Anu's website. Thank you, Anu. I came to see Fatal Love here on the second floor of the Queen's Museum with great excitement. This is before the renovation. Anu's work was right up there on the wooden platform that you can see as you step up the stairs, and it was a darker hallway, if I recall, so not so much light that was flooding into the space as it is now. I was super excited to see this show, super excited to come and support the artists and artworks here. Turning into the hallway, I immediately came across a glass vitrine within which was ensconced a small and delicate photographic installation. Glancing at Anu's name and birthplace, I assumed that the installation was a series of autobiographical documentary photographs, narrating her family's experience as immigrants in England in the 1960s and 1970s. The images took on a quality of Polaroid snapshots, faded in parts, overexposed with sunspots. The photographs were well-worn and gossamer thin. I hovered over the installation trying to make out the words inscribed alongside the photographs, but the text was obscured by tobacco leaves within the vitrine, and so I walked away to see other works in the show. At Fatal Love, I felt myself suffused by artworks like Matthews that made me feel visible, and through that visibility affirmed the experience of being in diaspora. My effusiveness at seeing Matthews' work among those of other artists was particularly keen following the surveillance and racialization of South Asian Americans in New York City after 9/11. So in that context of surveillance, to see and support visual culture created by South Asian American artists about the experience of being South Asian itself felt like a political statement. A decade later, in 2015, I once again came across Fabricated Memories, this time installed as part of Anu's solo show, Generations, at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. At this exhibition site, 2 copies of Fabricated Memories, you can see the glass vitrine on the far left of the image, 2 copies of Fabricated Memories were installed alongside each other in a glass case at the front of the gallery. I inhaled the sweet and smoky scent of tobacco, which was kept in a little sort of case right next to this vitrine, and I lingered over this installation. But it was only then that I realized that the photographs were not autobiographical, but generated entirely through Matthews' digital assemblage of old family photographs. Creating entirely new images through splicing, reproducing, collaging old family portrait photos, Matthews' series was not the straightforward representation of immigration, of her immigration rather, that I had initially assumed it to be. Instead, as I moved along the images, following the stream of text that threaded across these pages, and you can see that's a detailed shot, I saw how Fabricated Memories narrated a story of grief and loss. This recreated archive of family photography mourned not only the departure of Matthew's family from England to Bangalore 11 years after her birth, but also the rupture caused by the sudden death of her father from smoking-related illnesses a year later. As I walked through the installation, I saw the color images of Matthew's father fade out of the translucent pages, and there are images of Matthew herself as a little girl in some of the photographs. Worn and frayed at the edges, of work was serially organized like old snapshots that tumble out of shoeboxes. I realized with the start how, in my first encounter with fabricated memories here at Fatal Love, I had mapped the memories of my own childhood onto this series, willing my childhood in Japan in the 70s to look like the happiness of Matthew's childhood in England. It was my attachment to Matthew's work as a South Asian diasporic viewer who saw her own identity mirrored in the art objects around her, which had transformed this photographic series from a story of loss to a celebration of arrival. This was my uncanny memory, which transformed a fictive archive of images into my own family archive. So the intensity of my attachment to this aesthetic object meant that I could literally not see how the installation was in fact a narrative of grief and rage and loss. 10 years later, encountering the work in Toronto outside of the social and political context of Fatal Love, and in the midst of grieving my own family's departure from Japan 35 years later, I came to recognize the capacity of documentary photography to produce fictional narratives of diaspora. And then finally, in fall 2015, I had the opportunity to bring Matthew's work to 12 Gates Gallery in Philadelphia for an exhibition that I curated called Ruins and Fabrications. And here again, I could see how, and for the first time, I could touch fabricated memories. And it's an extraordinary experience to take that artwork out of the cigarette box that ensconces it and to lay it again on yet another glass box, and then to think through and observe the responses of viewers to the show. In public conversations that Anu and I had at 12 Gates, fabricated memories became a touchstone for a collective reflection on how photography can narrate history's compressed time across generations and bind together spaces across continents. Matthew's use of different photographic technologies produced images that never existed. But when we encounter these images, they encounter the feeling of having seen this archive before. And I'm just going to close out there. I spoke a lot about my own personal response to one artwork, but I just want to really emphasize that there is an extraordinarily intense attachment to aesthetic objects that I think generates much of our scholarship on South Asian diasporic visual culture, and I'm trying to figure out what are those relationships of identity and also alienation and estrangement, or what do we sometimes will these objects into becoming? I'm tracking the evolution of that. Thank you so much.
I also want to say that I'm coming as an outsider. My PhD and my writing is mostly on Islamic architecture, but when I was hired at San Francisco State, I was asked to teach everything, from the Rock of Gibraltar to the islands of Japan. But anyway, I took on the task with great interest, and then noticed pretty quickly that there wasn't enough literature and frameworks to help my students along, and when I was teaching them Asian American art. So I was very lucky at San Francisco State. We have a great gallery director, Mark Johnson, who is so generous and opens up that space every now and then so I can ask important questions about Asian American identity and how better to show Asian American art. So what I'm going to do is discuss 3 exhibitions that I was a part of as curator and consultant, and basically take you through that trajectory. And through these years, my first exhibition was in 2011, and the latest one was earlier this year. I kept seeing 3 threads circulating through and nodding through a lot of the art that I was able to show. One is that the diasporic art, both the South Asia and Asian America in general, has a radical aesthetic attached to it. And these are the 3 themes that I kept seeing come through in the art, and you can agree with me or disagree, I welcome it. One is a haunting of established narratives of immigration. The second is remapping to envision what is often overlooked, unpredicted, and unimagined.
and giving the particular, the right to the universal. And I think that last point was something that was discussed in the panel right before oh my God, it's the last talk of the last panel before the performance. That idea of giving the particular the right to the universal is not my words, but actually Suzanne Carter, who is a director of Contemporary Art Museum in Lisbon. So the first show that I was curating is called Picturing Parallax, photography and video from the South Asian diaspora. And this wouldn't have happened without the help of Jayashree, who introduced me to many of the great artists that were in the show. She herself, of course, with this, oh, didn't have it there. Do I have it? Oh, this one. Bijli, Heart of a Drag Queen, which was a video of, yes, this wonderful performer who lived in Coney Island, Pakistani American, who came to Coney Island as a refugee and basically performs as a drag queen. But in this haunting song is basically a song of longing for home of Pakistan. And it's the type of multiplicity of identity that we don't often associate with migration, immigration, especially with refugees who are expected to really cut their ties with their origins and just be happy Americans. And that wasn't the case. Getting back to the title, the parallax, Picturing Parallax, I thought this was a very important way for my students to engage with photography and video of the South Asian diaspora because of the productive space that's created in the parallax. What is a parallax? Well, it comes in three forms. The stellar parallax that enable people to understand where they were situated during maritime travel by looking at the stars. Then you have the photographic parallax, that gap between the lens and what the eye sees that one needs to correct for. And then finally, what I call the parallax of the South Asian diaspora that says, we're not going to correct anything. We love this space. We love the gap because it's productive and ambivalent, and it's something that will give us the freedom to really start questioning veracity, truth-telling, and the monocular claims of photography. So the second show that I was a consultant for and then wrote an article for the Perspectives piece is on hierarchy. What is hierarchy? It's a post-colonial and positional framework that uses water and the relations with water as sites of material and critical resistance. So hierarchy as artistic focus brings to surface the tragic and seemingly illicit, unauthorized experiences of post-colonial and diasporic experience in not a dialectic way, but what was called a dialectics by Campbell Braithwaite, who's a poet and academic from Barbados. So this is just another way, another interpretive lens for my students to understand diasporic art. One of the artists that was featured, an Asian American artist, is Jennifer Wofford, and her MacArthur Nurses, which references this idea of the cyclical, the going, the coming. We are here because you were over there, and that kind of logic that is not often associated with migration and immigration. And then finally, I worked with Kathy Zaror on an exhibition called Mashrabiya. What is a Mashrabiya? In India, South Asia, Pakistan, we call it a jali. And that's that screen that one can look through, women can look through and engage with the public space without being seen. I used it here, this latticed window, as an argumentative way to help bring back focus to the way the audience sees diasporic art. So I can talk more about this. I think I have to end right now, but like the veil, it was a very productive and powerful way of getting students to understand the complexities of this, the art coming out of diaspora.
I'll ask all of the panelists artists to come up to the table and have a little bit of a discussion. So.
I'm actually just going to make a call to you guys. Please be the ones who ask the questions. 100% of the time, we are the ones who are interrogating artists and curators, and I would very much like this to be turned around this time. So, if anyone has any questions, thoughts.
Okay, so I have the world's longest question, so it's like 4 questions, and I'm going to do my best. There's so much that you all brought up that is so resonant and meaningful. So the first thing I just want to say very quickly is thank you so much for just naming the fact that our scholarship has been actively discouraged by institutions of accreditation to a significant extent during a formative period of our development as a community of artists and scholars, because that's something that's actually a wall that I myself have actually face-planted against probably a half dozen times in the last 15 years, of not being palatable to art historical departments in this country, because I am South Asian and I don't want to actively ignore that in my work. Not even that I necessarily want to directly focus on it, but that I don't want to exclude it. But the thing that I found so productive in thinking about that I want to put to this panel has to do with some of the photography that was shown. And it began with the image of the partition. And this question about sort of who owns these images. Is it Margaret Borg White who owns the image that she creates? Is it American art history that owns these images of partition? Is it the artists who appropriate those images? Do we even know what we look like from the inside? And my sense of myself as a South Asian born and raised in the United States is that to a great extent, what I look like as a South Asian is actually externally imposed, so it's very hard to fit that. And it put me in mind of this recent controversy where the Indian photographer Sunil Datta was exposed as having appropriated an image of a transgender female sex worker from a Marielle Mark photograph and used that image, flopped it, and used it to replace the image of a cisgendered female sex worker that he had photographed who had not given her consent to be photographed. Now remember that when Marielle Mark was taking these photographs, she was not really concerned with the consent of her subject. So there's a shift. And at the same time, I'm so interested in how this image both regenders this transgender person into a cisgendered person through this flopping, and also is so completely framed by the idea that the best way to get exposure is to sell the West an image of India that is actually the West's own image. So I would like to put those ideas to you in the context of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I think what's interesting when you ask this question about Margaret Borg White and who owns those images, and then you mentioned the fact that she's American, I think that we can't overlook how influential these images were even within the context of India, or more specifically Delhi. And I'm thinking of Khushwant Singh, who looked at Margaret Borg White's images and actually generated an entire novel from them. So it's not just, I would say, operating within a Western paradigm because she is American. I think that there is a question of certainly a transnationalism at that moment, and the fact that these images circulated so widely within India. I think another point that's interesting is the way in which, for example, if we think about Margaret Borg White, before she entered India, she was actually photographing the camps in Germany. And when she first arrived in Calcutta, she noted that, for example, that what she saw on the streets of Calcutta looked so much like what she saw in Buchenwald, right? So I think that the issue becomes much more complex, and there are these circuits of her own trajectory that inform these particular photographs. For example, what she saw then at the camps, she would have informed the way she photographed within the context of Calcutta in '46. So I think that that would be my response to that question, and maybe I'll start.
Thank you. My position is that this is a way to open a new set of conversations in a completely different forum. And as an American art historian, somebody who studies American art and has spent years working on a PhD that used traditional methodologies and interpretive mechanisms to look at American artistic production, there is simply not a language to accommodate the study of these objects in the way that I want to study them, which is the fact that they were used contemporaneously by such incredibly significant and influential people as Khushwant Singh, and also the agenda that Henry Luce, who sent Margaret Bourke-White to India, had on his mind, which was, this is the downfall of a huge empire and America is on its way up. You go and take those pictures. So all of these imperatives, all of these imperialistic concerns, and then Margaret Bourke-White, when writing about the photographs, using the American Revolutionary War, the independence movement within America from colonial forces of Britain, all of those analogies and parallelisms have to be explored. And then to look at these two artists who migrated here and have found a larger voice and different methodologies to explore what they want to represent as Americans, as global citizens, I think needs to be discussed.
Do we have any other questions here, or do you have any other comments? Anyone else wants to respond to that question? Okay.
Respond very quickly from another perspective. I was thinking about Anu, your artwork, An Indian from India, which uses the Curtis images, and I'm also thinking about Gary Gill's The Americans, which is a riff on Robert Frank's Americans, and Seher Shah, another artist I work with, who looks at colonial landscape photography. So in all of these different instances, you can think about the artist's use of these imperial archives as a form of appropriation, right? But I think that there needs to be maybe a different kind of vocabulary to think about these sorts of artistic processes, and then also their impact on us as viewers. Because in a way, I think that sometimes, I know myself as someone who sort of devours South Asianized work, visual culture in a number of different forms, part of the impulse is always to look for new or better or more diverse forms of representation. And the more I do this work, the more I feel like that's impossible. And one of the reasons that it's impossible is because we're always haunted by these imperial archives that provide us with ways of looking at ourselves. So as we see these objects, we're also constantly reminded of these other ways in which we have been photographed. Not me personally, right? But like archives of how, say, South Asians have been documented in colonial ethnography. That archive of images is never going to go away. So then what do we do with it, right? It's just an open-ended question. I just wanted to say that I don't think it's ever going to go away.
Do we have any other questions here? So I'm thinking about Anu's question about the walls that people have felt in trying to study this kind of work in the past. And the blockades that came my way are the reason why I didn't continue with it, and I actually left graduate school in art history. So I'm wondering, and this is a little... Sure. Is that better? Sorry. Do you want me to start over? Oh, sorry. So I'm thinking about the question that Anu asked, and I'm thinking about the kind of blockades that prevented many of us from doing this kind of work in the early 90s. Myself in particular, I left graduate school because the University of Chicago was poorly equipped to support my research in this arena. And I'm wondering, this is a little more of a pragmatic question or a generational question, less about the content you've delivered, but I'm curious about shifts that you are seeing. You are in academic appointments, many of you, where you are seeing potential shifts. Are you seeing the next generation coming up that is going to be ready, or that you are equipping to take this further? I'm thinking a little bit about some of the comments that came up about experiences in the 80s and 90s. Can you speak to that a bit?
Is this on? Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking about my own students and the 18, 19, 20-year-olds who have a more sophisticated understanding, and they expect us to teach about the world that the way they see it. So it's almost like we have to change our methods, and we can't keep struggling with our past, what was going on in the 80s and 90s, but we have to update our way of seeing and the notion of intersectionality. The first time I heard that term was from a student who said, of course, this is intersectionality. What are you talking about? Multiplicity is intersectionality. So I'm finding that we're the ones who have to catch up with what's going on with these younger generations. I come from San Francisco, and my students are basically Asian American, Chicano students who are already thinking about these things in a very complex way than the way I grew up. So that's my take on it.
Anyone else? Actually, I would like to respond to that question as someone who just graduated. So I'd like to be the other side of that question. When I joined art history, it was Islamic art history at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. I was the only major that I was accepted for. I was quite solitary. I was the only person in my field for 3 years at my school. And the reason my professor chose to limit his acceptance of students is because he knew that he could not flood the market with his students because there are so few opportunities for Islamic art historians. So I think that when we discuss the shifting paradigms or shifting approaches to art histories and the diversifications and whatnot, what frustrates me a great deal about these kinds of conversations is we don't talk about money. I mean, the fact is that there's no jobs out there, and we are all, I mean, academia in certain senses is imploding, you know? In the schools that I'm at a postdoc, there's no more tenure track hires in my field. So, and I'm the one person representing people of color studies. It was global and non-Western. My postdoc title has changed a number of times, representing, again, the weird sort of lack of nuance that many academic studies have when approaching this kind of question. So, like, I feel like we just really need to discuss money more.
I was wondering if any of you have considered learning the native languages of your respective origins, you know. And because, like in German, they say that there are some things in German that cannot never be translated into English, you know. It's just that pure. And I wonder if that element of language, the original, you know, Hindi, whatever, Punjabi, etc., or even Sanskrit, you know, that's a mindset on its own, I believe, and it's a very specific way of looking at the native experience. And have you explored that to you know, as a way of really capturing something that's beyond the English framework or you know, the Western framework? Because what I've been hearing the whole days, of course, English is the medium that's been used, right? And I've noticed also tools of analysis, you know, a good number of it is Western, but it's very flexible, I'm sure. But has there been an effort to go outside that box, you know, and even come close to the native tongue, whatever, if that makes sense to you?
Well, I was not born here. I came to the US when I was 29. So, you know, I am very much familiar with regional languages in India. One is my native tongue, but on different degrees of understanding, speaking, and reading, I do that with different languages. Some I read. I even had to study Sanskrit in high school when I was in high school, early 70s. So yes, I mean, that comes up all the time. And basically what I tell my students is that, like, you know, we have been dealing with all kinds of texts in artists' works, that I had this anxiety as well when I came to this country, that I have to make people understand what the text means. And we are past that. So I tell my students that you don't have to necessarily understand the content of the text. Like Shirin Nishad, Iranian artist, you know, her whole photographs are, you know, full of painted scripts from Shahnameh, and you couldn't possibly read that, even if you read Farsi. But her point is that you don't have to understand the content. It is the language as a medium right in front of you as a veil. That's what matters. And I kind of tell my students, just get rid of that anxiety. See it as, calligraphy, visual form. Fine. I mean, and if there is a kind of a barrier of understanding because of that, you think you cannot understand the art, well, the other is unknowable. You cannot understand the other, 100%. And that's part of the game. So, yeah, it happens all the time in teaching.
I think I also just want to push back a little bit on the question, in part because the question you're asking is actually a question that a lot of artists themselves grapple with, which is the question of authenticity, right? That's really what your question is about. And so if you're talking about diasporic artists, right, I mean, this question of authenticity kind of always haunts diasporic art. And in the work that I was talking about, right, by a South African Indian artist, I also write about a Kenyan Indian artist, the question of language is sort of irrelevant, right? I mean, they might be Gujarati or Sikh or whatever, but like the question of authenticity is actually already tied to the diaspora, right? So like, what does it mean to not be black enough in the Kenyan context? What does it mean to not be Afrikaans enough in the South African context, right? I mean, that's another. So I think that question of authenticity might be a little broader, than the way you framed it, depending on the kind of context. And again, I think it's about not always assuming that South Asia is that space of authenticity, right? So I just kind of maybe wanted to say that.
I just wanted to add, I thought your question was interesting because somebody like Zarina, one of the artists that I'm going to be examining in my next book, writes Urdu, but she doesn't write it herself. She sends the work to Pakistan and has a Pakistani calligrapher write it out. Why? Because she's been here for so long, she feels like she's lost her touch. So, something to think about. Thank you.
I just want to piggyback on what both of you said, and just to emphasize that the experience of diaspora means that South Asia is not always our point of origin. So in my case, my native language, the language I spoke first and I still dream in, is Japanese. But I'm not a scholar of Japanese modern or ancient or contemporary art. I'm a scholar of South Asian diasporas. So in that context, and the Japanese language that I speak is not the thing that we should be focusing on.
We have one question, last question from Pragya.
So can I just... Thank you for all your presentations. They were really interesting. I just had a question in terms of, as art historians, how receptive have maybe art historians working in South Asia, or maybe art departments or artists? I'm wondering how much in terms of diasporic art history of South Asia has been integrated necessarily within, curriculums or the receptivity to to a lot of these discussions. I'm wondering what that dialogue is like.
That's what I said in my comments, that it's in process. It's much better now than it was in the 90s when I was a teaching assistant, but you go through these ups and downs all the time, depending on, the kind of faculty composition, depending on the institution. But I would say it's much better. It's happening. Now I don't have to put out a defensive argument in order to introduce certain material.
Is this on? Okay. Yeah, the jobs are there. I think they're coming up more and more. What I'm finding the problem is that once we're hired and we bring our post-colonial argumentative perspective, that we're finding it harder and harder to get accepted and get promoted and get tenured. So that is the problem. There's not enough of a critical mass that says, yeah, once we hire these people, how are we going to support them throughout this process? And that's what is the next barrier. The visibility is there, but not the, the support.
I just want to bring on the panel, and this is a really relevant
thing I just want to throw out there right now, that I teach at Fresno State University, and we're actually currently doing a search for an Asian art historian. So just a heads up, I'd love to see somebody in this room snag that job. It would totally make my life. I'm not on the search committee, so I think I can say that without having a conflict.
Is there anybody else? This is probably one of the
Yeah, so if there's not any urgent comments that need to be made right now, I want to thank all the panelists for their thoughtful presentations, as well as all the moderators today, as well as all of you for your thoughtful questions and for your attention through a long day. Hopefully you'll be able to digest this a little bit more organically over food and drink. Hopefully we can... Normally on Saturday nights there is a Queen's Night Market. I'm not sure if the rain did anything to it. I haven't had a chance to check. But the Queen's Night Market is amazing. Everything is, around $5. And it's basically, if you go to the right, there's past our parking lot, a little bridge that goes over to the other side, and the Hall of Science is there. The parking lot of the Hall of Science is where the Queen's Night Market is. They have, hundreds of vendors of a variety of mixtures, very authentic and very inauthentic. Food will be available for your, sorry, do you have? Oh, yeah, so hopefully that's still on, and the little showers that we've had haven't stopped it. Usually they do go on unless it's like raining continuously, so that might be a fun Queen's way of experiencing the food culture. There's also lots of things on the 7 train for those of you who are out of town. If you take the 7 train further east to Flushing, it's the largest Chinatown. Has more restaurants probably per square foot than you can imagine. And then if you take the 7 train west towards Manhattan, of course, any stop you get off on, there'll be restaurants and Jackson Heights, 74th Street, definitely a lot of South Asian and Latino restaurants there as well for you to try if you want to get a little bit more Queens in your life since you're here. Maybe you're, I urge you to take advantage of those opportunities. And hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow where we do this all over again, and we have more panels and finale performances by Lahore Pakistan, and as well as Faluda Islam. 12 Gates has been so generous in supporting that performance, and we're going to start bright and early again, 10 tomorrow. We're going to start off the day with Art in the Public Sphere, which I'll be moderating. And thank you very much, and enjoy your evening. Okay, so another logistics piece, especially if